Good afternoon and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, marketing specialist, and I will be your moderator. I hope everyone had a happy new year and safe and relaxing holiday season. We are excited to welcome Ryan Cathers as our speaker tonight as he will discuss renegotiating your dental lease in the new year. Ryan is the manager of healthcare leasing for Cirrus Consulting Group. Before we get started, we have a few reminders for you. At any point during tonight's webinar, we encourage your participation through the chat and Q&A features. Please type in any questions you might have into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we will answer them live at the end of the presentation. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, as well as Cirrus Consulting Group. Ryan, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. We're all looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome everyone. I know it's been a long, exhausting day, I'm sure. So certainly do appreciate taking the time out of your evening to join us. There's certainly going to be a lot we're going to cover, a lot to learn, and an update on the real estate market. Welcome to the webinar on our New Year's resolution that comes around every year and renegotiating my most expensive contract. And it's really a component of the practice where whether you're starting up a practice, acquiring a practice, renewing your lease, expanding the practice, or transitioning out of the practice, acquiring a property and practicing out of that space, it becomes this tool and this relationship where it can make that process as seamless and as smooth as possible or as painful as can be. So really, we're going to learn a lot about today, and I don't want to get too much into it too quickly, but a lot of those different facets, whether it's from a financial standpoint, how to avoid overpaying in rents and other types of financials, and some of the different legal components to look out for, and what's the newest update in terms of the market and the trends and what's occurring, obviously, with COVID-19 occurring around the world. But first and foremost, I want to thank Henry Schein for having us today. I certainly appreciate it as well. So I think to begin, it's very important to know a few different numbers: 85, 54, and 80. %85 of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them the right to at least 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold. 85, 54, and 80. Now, I think it's important to know a little bit about us for those who might be unfamiliar about us. So we're a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm who were founded by dentists for dentists just a little over 26 years ago now. And since inception, we've now negotiated over 12,000 leases. And what makes us really unique across North America is we have an in-house legal team comprised of highly experienced real estate attorneys and lease negotiators with a background of healthcare and tenant representation. We have an in-house leasing team that have access to rental rates and comparables in any given market. And we have an in-house consulting team that essentially work alongside the legal and leasing teams to really help develop a strategy for the negotiations. On an annual basis, to give you an idea, we now represent over 500 doctors each year. We deliver over 100 continuing education credits on an annual basis. So again, as Adam mentioned, that's not offered today, but we do offer, typically they would be in person in the form of seminars and lectures, where I would be flying into a certain area and hosting this course. Typically it's a little bit longer as well, but obviously through webinars as well online. We do typically lecture at most of the major dental conventions as well, such as the Greater New York, Pacific Dental, the Yankee, and the California Dental as well. Now, the purpose of today's session are a fewfold. Firstly, we're going to discuss some of the real market trends, the January 2021 update, what we've seen thus far. We're going to go through some of the pros and cons of buying versus leasing. It's a question that I'm asked on a regular basis. Should I buy property or should I lease space? 7 financial negotiables in your lease. Winning strategies to negotiate a lease during COVID-19. Going through a few of the $100,000 risks that are hidden in your lease that you may or may not know about. And lastly, how and when to broach the topic of renegotiation with your landlord. And again, as Adam mentioned, I do encourage, typically, I'm hosting this lecture in person, and I do encourage engagement and any questions that you may have, clarifications, what have you, please do address them through the Q&A section in your pop-up bar. If the question is relevant to the current slide, I will address them then. If it's covered later on in the lecture, I'll bring it back up then. If not, I will be going through questions at the end. I'll leave some time for that. Now, market trends. So in terms of a national update on rents, vacancies, and what you'll see is that rental rates, depending on where you are, they're very specific to, even in some cases, block to block, let alone city to city, town to town, and so forth, where certain properties have seen a major shift and others, more of the class A type of, where there's grocery tenants and things of that nature, have not seen much of a shift, where some landlords are continuing to hold firm through there. So really depends on the type of property that you're in, will depend on the trends of the rental rates that we've seen in the area. And vacancies, many have likely seen a large amount of vacancies in their property or the area, with certain types of businesses that require consumers to come in, but they're not considered essential. So this has been a huge opportunity, as we'll get to later on in the lecture, where we've had a number of doctors looking to expand their businesses. This is the time. Finally, there's space now, or finally, there's the opportunity to take advantage of the rental rate components by expanding or relocating to another property or space. What have been the landlord's responses? So I touched on it very briefly, taking one of two paths, either holding very firm or, again, depending on the situation and their situation more particularly, there has been flexibility on rental rates and comparables. Part 2, deferrals and abatements, PPP. So in terms of this component, some landlords are still allowing for any sort of deferrals and abatements. Really depends on the consistency of the tenant paying their rent through everything thus far. If there's been a number of deferrals and abatements to date, then many have been hesitant to allow for any more unless we get very creative in the conversations. But again, depends on your situation. Renewals and new starts. So many have been looking to secure long-term leases in order to not only secure their predictability, but obviously assist with yours as well. So some cases, some renewals have occurred earlier than they typically would. Or for a new start, many landlords are getting very, very, we'll say, generous with their offerings in order to get you and convince you to come into the space. Because with the increase in vacancy, they need to fill that space. Now, in terms of the market updates. So just before we go through the market updates, I apologize. I actually forgot regarding the polls. So I'm going to ask Adam, actually. We're going to do a bit of a survey of the attendees this evening. So that way we have a good idea of who's here, who's attending. So it better helps me understand how I can cater my lecture towards the attendance here, or include different components that may have not, based on what I'm told through here. So you'll see on your screen a poll has popped up. So there's a few questions on there and to give me a better sense of what you're looking to learn today and how I can cater my PowerPoint and lecture towards you. So in terms of Boston, so again, these are going to be very general updates because it's very specific in terms of your type of property, your area, whether it's the city, the suburb, the block, and so forth as well. But the average rental rates and the trends is really what you're looking at for these graphs here. So you'll see the vacancy rates increasing as the orange line, obviously significantly based on the timing of it, which is no surprise. But you'll notice the rental rates. The rental rates did not see the same type of adjustment as the vacancy rate did as well. And you'll see where it's trending back towards. So it's interesting to see there. Right now, the average rental rates in Boston, this is located downtown, is just hovering around $54.50 a square foot. Again, really depends on specifically where you are, but just to give you an idea of some of the trends. Very similarly in Chicago, you notice the vacancy rate skyrocketing up, but the rental rates having a little bit more dip than Boston, but still climbing back up to where the market was headed as well. So they're having around just shy of $32 a square foot. In Miami, you'll notice not much change with rental rates, regardless of the vacancy rate changes. So this is where some of the misconception of what's going on. There's a ton of vacancy in my building. Now I should be paying half rent. Unfortunately, the reality is landlords are looking to hold firm unless you have something to give in return. So we're going to touch on some of the negotiables or elegant negotiables as well that have helped our clients obviously save, long short of it. In San Francisco, so for those of you who are on our West Coast, this is on a per year basis, the way the graph is. If you're looking for through California, or if you are in parts of Washington State or Hawaii, typically it's on a per month basis. So you divide by 12 for these. So if you're looking towards this, it's just shy of likely in and around $4.75 a square foot in terms of the average rents. Now you've seen Francisco particularly a significant increase in rents and significant increase in vacancies. So this is something in an area where there's been a lot more opportunity to save very quickly. Again, depends on the property that you're in, but the probability is there. New York City, very similar in terms of, or not similar, but in terms of the increase in vacancies and the impact on rents. Very similar to the Boston, Chicago types of graphs as well. Now, buying versus leasing. So this is a question I'm asked regularly. Should I buy a property? Should I buy my condominium? Or should I lease space? Which is better? And it really depends on the opportunity. A. B. Depends on the individual. And C. Depends on what your plans are. Some are looking, I was speaking with a doctor on the West Coast who is aggressively looking to open up 8 practices before merging with another medium-sized group before entering into a larger type of group. And this is a situation where they were asking, should I buy property? And I said, it depends on the capital. Depends on what you're looking to, as buying requires a large upfront financial investment, which means you don't have as much working capital to open up another location, for example, if all of your capital is tied up in buying a property and building out a practice. Now, if that's something as part of your goal, obviously, fantastic. I'm not saying one or the other is better, but depends on your goals and depends on you because you're also become a landlord, which means A, if the toilet is plugged, you have to call a plumber. Or your tenants, if it's a multi-tenant property, call you to call someone. So it becomes 2 jobs. You can earn rental income. So if you have a multi-tenant or if you eventually transition your practice and you hold on to the real estate, great to have rental income. You have greater flexibility on how to use the space. So if you want to expand, change the configuration, make any additions, you don't have to get the landlord's consent as you are the landlord. And you have the freedom to control the property. So if you want to change the layout of the parking lot or the way the lawn's set up or signage, things of that nature. Now, there was also a doctor near Boston, outside actually, whose town unfortunately took a turn. And this was pre COVID-19. And unfortunately had to relocate his practice, move to a leased space in the neighboring town. But unfortunately, as pros and cons with anything, he's now held with this property that he has to pay still for mortgage. Yet there's no business operating inside. So relocating becomes easier. Now, on the leasing side, requires a smaller upfront payment, more working capital to, maybe you're building out a higher quality of practice in terms of materials or extra equipment that you typically wouldn't have by day one. And again, the flexibility to relocate or expand if it's a bigger property. Typically, many of these emerging enterprise or group practices will lease, at least to start, because again, you have the greater working capital to begin to open up the next practice or two or acquire next practices. But at the heart of it all is a dental lease. Whether you own your property or you lease your property, a dental lease in place is critical. Now, 7 financial negotiables in your lease. First and foremost, that everyone knows and everyone will comment and believe everyone is overpaying is base rent. Now, again, as you may recall earlier in the presentation, 54% of you are actually overpaying in rent. The other 46, you are not, regardless if you feel that way as well. But base rent is one of the main and top topics in terms of how to save. But there's a number of different other ways of saving as well that many don't realize. The annual increase. Typically, the average annual increase across the country has been about 3% on an annual basis. Anything higher, a little bit high, anything lower is obviously great. Now it's about managing that increase as well. Common area maintenance or CAM charges. So many of you are on what's called a triple net lease, whereby you pay the proportionate share of the insurance, taxes, and maintenance of the building. Now, many don't realize is landlords use this as a profit center. I'll correct myself. Not all landlords, but many use this as a bit of a profit center. So ensuring that you have full transparency of what you're actually paying for. There's a doctor I was speaking with last year who had received a reconciliation statement, very broad, and had a $4,500 miscellaneous charge. So I asked, what was this for? He replied, I don't know. Did you ask? No. Did you pay it? Yes. This is how many dentists, unfortunately, overpay in various different financials. Fixturing. So the fixturing period is when you gain possession of a space, whether it's a new space or expansion space, and you have the ability to build out and construct the space. Typically, during this period, you should not be paying rent, typically just utilities. Now, what is an average length of term? So it depends on where you are. In some areas, it's more common to have 3 months. Some areas, it's best to have 6 months of fixturing. Ideally, that is the bar, but really depends on the situation, all of the different moving parts. But fixturing is when you gain possession of the space to construct, but you don't have to pay rent. Free rent is when doors open and you get additional months of free rent of not having to pay to help alleviate some of the initial financial burden. Tenant improvement allowance. So this is a component of your lease where the landlord gives you money in order to help outfit the space, used for any upgrades for the space itself. Now, many don't realize is it's not free money. They bake that right into the rental rates that you pay, typically with interest. Not to say don't take any, but we need to be cognizant of how much we're taking and how it impacts the rental rates that you're paying. What a fair amount is will really depend on the situation, all the different moving parts. And seventh, landlord work. Many forget that you're still on top of the top 6 items. You're still able to get the landlord to do work, whether it's electrical, wall partitions, things of that nature. So all of these 7 financial negotiables, most of them using in whether it's a new start practice or an expansion. Certain components will be addressed on renewals and things like that as well, but they all interchange with each other. The landlords, they look at it, they look at the deal as a whole. You need to be as well. And that's what we assist with our clients is ensuring, okay, hey, look, this is good. This is what it saves you overall. This is how this is going to impact you now. This is how this is going to impact you in the future. It's good for you to evaluate what is the deal compared to now, compared to what you'd be paying for in the future. The doctor I was speaking with who said, and to each their own, they were going to they were going to personally pay for all of the construction of a practice because they wanted their base rent as low as possible because they knew on renewal it only goes up from there, typically. So there's strategies to each negotiation. And again, if anyone has any questions, I highly encourage utilize the Q&A section. I will be going through questions as well at the end if you have any additional ones. But how to maximize your leverage. So you are the best tenant on the planet. And it's really shown that over the past year where you've been stable, you've been able to pay your rent, typically majority on time, or kept up with it compared to other businesses. I'm sure you many, as you can see by the vacancies, have not been able to. You continue to add value to the property with clients, being an essential service, and being built in with your leaseholds. Don't underestimate your leverage and how important you are to that plaza or building. Put yourself in the landlord's shoes. At the end of the day, the lease is really a relationship between tenant and landlord where the landlord wants a tenant who's going to be paying their bills, pays them on time, and for a long time. You want a great home for the practice. That's where the relationship is. So it needs to be fair. So if you do a little math on your tenancy expense, think about it. Many practices do not relocate in their lifetime, many of them. And if you do, you can still do some math. How much tenancy expense, so base rent, you can even include additionals if you'd like, would you pay over the course of your career? Or if you're evaluating whether to stay or go in this location, how much would you pay over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? How much are you committing to the landlord? Many only think of their $5,000 a month rent check that they have to pay or whatever it is. They don't think of if you add that $5,000 a month over the course of 12 months, over the course of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they're paying over $2 million to the landlord over the course of their career without including escalations. Plan, prepare, and prioritize. Plan, prepare, and prioritize. What are you looking to do? What are the different opportunities you're evaluating? What ducks do you need in a row in order to prepare for them? Do I need financing? Do I need a lease consultant? Do I need an equipment specialist? What do I need? What quotes do I need? What experts do I need to speak with? Do I need to speak with partners to determine is this going to be a viable option or a realistic option? And then prioritize. What are your high priority, medium priority, or low priority items or situations? And how do you progress through them? Now may be the time to relocate. Many clients that we're assisting right now are not necessarily 100% relocating, but are seriously considering it now more than ever because there are vacancies and landlords that are willing to get very, very generous in terms of what they're willing to offer to induce them to get into their property. They know, and as well as you know, it's time consuming, it's a headache, and it's expensive to relocate a practice. They know that. So typically, when you find a home, it's a long term home. So many of them have been getting very, very generous to lure clients and dentists into their properties and with attractive rental rates, free rents, fixed rent, things of that nature. So now maybe the time, if you were thinking about it before, if your building's kind of run down, the area's run down, now may be the time to at least consider it. But why is the office lease so important, particularly during COVID? The office location is the foundation of your practice. Foundation, foundation, foundation. It ties you to that space. No lease, no location, no patience. Investment or cost to build. Depending on where you are in the country, depending on the property, the building, it can cost anywhere from $115 a square foot, well over $300 a square foot. If you're in an area with union laws, there are some in the country that are well over $600-700 a square foot. Obviously, vary on where you are, the type of property, the quality you're looking for. The point is, it's expensive. The lease secures your investment, ensures it's protected. As I mentioned earlier, very difficult, expensive, and time consuming to move. On average, again, could vary where you are, on average, 18 to 24 months to properly relocate a practice. And that's from just concept or idea or need to all of a sudden relocate to finding a space, negotiating the lease, designs, permits, architecture, construction to doors open. From concept and idea to doors open. 18 to 24 months to properly relocate a practice. The lease is also critical in the practice sale. Most will think, well, I'm getting out, so it doesn't matter to me. Well, actually, the lease can make or break the sale of your practice. Would you prefer it works as an asset? Would you prefer it works as a liability? But I'll touch on more on that in a few minutes. Your lease gives you leverage. Little do many know, lease also gives you leverage because again, you're committing a rent check to the landlord for X amount of time, whether it's a 5-year term, 10-year term, or somewhere in between. That is value. So know your value. Now, what should your office lease do for you? Provide fair and affordable financial terms first and foremost. So, again, very common. Touched on a little bit earlier. Rental rates is typically the most common that everyone thinks of. But again, that's not the only financial term. Many landlords will have you focus on those in order to have other items inserted or other ways of increasing rents or financial inducements for them. Long-term stability and security. So in most cases, it depends on the goals as well, but in most cases, we'll recommend a 10-year term with multiple 5-year options to renew. Secure as much term as possible for the practice if someone's not looking to relocate. It's like buying in bulk. You typically get a better deal. And B, it secures the tenancy and the security of the practice for the long term. as well as can help facilitate the sale of the practice. Many of you may or may not know, but most banks and lenders now, in most cases, you need 10 years of term left on the lease in order to finance an acquisition. And that's whether it's in the form of initial term and or options to renew, depending if they are transferable to a buyer. If you're unsure if your options are transferable, you certainly need to find out. There's a doctor who was leveraged during their sale for $120,000 because their options were personal to them. The landlord would only transfer them to the buyer for that amount and amend the lease. Minimize risk and exposure. So many of you, or most, have either signed the lease personally or have signed a personal guarantee, whether you know it or not. What that essentially means is if there's ever a dispute between yourself and the landlord, they can come after you personally. How does that impact your personal assets? Should you be providing any personal liability? Is it common in your case? Maximizing your flexibility. So incorporating in what's called a right of first refusal, whether it's to purchase the property or to expand the practice to the vacant space. It gives you first right to either one. There's a number of different ways it can be structured, but if one of your goals is either to purchase or expand, handy to have this in here. So it may not be a plan today, but if the opportunity occurs in the future, you have the ability to utilize it. Enhance your ability to sell the practice. Again, would you prefer your lease to work as an asset or as a liability? Now, how to structure your lease post COVID-19. So, here are some of the $100,000 risks that are hidden within your lease. And we say that because many of them can either impact whether they terminate the lease, they increase rental rates, not only for today, but future considerations as well through renewals and escalations, whether they have you relocate and pay for it. There's a number of different provisions here that, as many may or may not know on the webinar today, where if these occur, not to say they occur in 100% of situations, but if they occur, they are expensive situations. So items like a demolition clause, for example, whereby the landlord has the ability to redevelop the property, and typically they just have to give you 30 to 90 days notice. Is typically the way it's structured. So if you're in an area that there's a lot of redevelopment, certainly need to look and review your lease if this is a component. Or death and disability provision, where God forbid something were to happen to you and you're no longer able to practice, you or your estate would have the ability to either A, terminate the lease, or B, assign the lease. It would skip the typical sale process based on the extreme circumstances. Because the lease does not just disappear. Many think, well, God forbid something were to happen, then the landlord just takes back the space. That's not the case. There was a situation we were made aware of, unfortunately, by one of the children, where a doctor had passed away prior to opening his new practice. Beautiful practice. They were trying to sell it very quickly. 3 months before the lease actually started, 10-year term, $8,000 a month in rent for the first year, let alone escalations. The landlord did not let them off. Practice is now overvalued. There's no patience. The family was trying to recoup some of the investment into it. But they didn't have the ability to terminate the lease either. Other items such as the relocation provision, whereby the landlord has the ability to ask you to relocate to another space on the property. And typically, the way it's structured, they make you pay for it. So, again, many of these provisions can impact you, not limited to, there are a number of other provisions as well. But to give you a few examples, the assignment provision. So, this provision essentially outlines the transferability of your lease in the event that you look to sell a practice. Now, this is found in 75% of dental leases we negotiate, many of which have been negotiated by quote unquote dental specific real estate attorneys. Now, typically, I would leave a few minutes for the lecture room to read. Now, given this is an online webinar, I'll walk through with it right now. So, everything highlighted in orange is something that is potentially problematic through a practice sale. So the first potentially problematic item is that in order to sell your practice, you need first to have received the consent from the landlord. Very common in commercial real estate. What's unusual about this component is it just states you need the landlord's consent. Some of the common ways that it's also structured, that many believe that they are protected, where it states with consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. The problem with that is, what's the definition of unreasonable? So in this case, really, it's a rainy day. The landlord has no need to consent to the transfer. It goes on to say that they either have the option to 1, approve, 2, decline the request, or 3, terminate the lease. How much is your practice worth if the lease is terminated? A question I typically get is, why would they want to terminate? They're getting a new beautiful tenant who's going to be there long term. Maybe they want to repurpose the space, bring in a different tenant. Many use it, and there was one case in San Francisco where they had it in there because they wanted to be able to increase rents when that transition occurred. How much is your practice worth if they terminate and go lease it out to the purchaser? Now you're not the one facilitating the built out practice. It goes on to say that the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent during the term to the greater of the then current market rent, or 15% greater of the current rent. So essentially, the long short of it is rent's going up at least 15%. It goes on in the next paragraph to reference consideration language, which essentially means the landlord's entitled to a percentage of the sale proceeds when you sell the practice. Now, there was a doctor, it's one of our more extreme situations. I'm not sure if it was mentioned on one of our previous webinars, but it was a doctor who had conditionally sold his practice. He'd been in the space for 36 years. He's quote unquote family friends with his landlord for 22 of them, patient, and went to his landlord, his family friend, as per his lease to ask for consent. And the landlord said happy to on one of 3 options and conditions. A, your rent goes up 35%. B, you pay me 50% of the sale proceeds, 50. Or C, I terminate the lease. I can tell you they're not family friends anymore. There's some choice words that were had, but 50% is one of the more extreme situations that we've heard of. Typically, landlords are looking for anywhere between 15 to 30% of sale proceeds, when in reality, they should be receiving 0. Now, it goes on to say, the last sentence, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Essentially, what this referring to is ongoing liability. So even after you sell the practice and transition out, you are still liable for the lease obligations should the buyer default. And if you've signed the lease personally or provided a personal guarantee, it's both the business and you personally. There's a doctor in Michigan I'll never forget. In 2017, I was speaking with him. He'd retired, moved down to South Florida, received a call 8 years later from the landlord. Buyer had defaulted. Critical. This is addressed. And depending on where you are, there could be a situation of ideally a release or some sort of limitation. Whether it's some sort of expiry, capital monetary value, or some sort of blend. But the long and short of it, this whole provision, again, found that 75% of the leases we're negotiating needs to be redrafted. And I do have a question in the queue, and I will address it later, just to let you know for the individual that had asked. Now, landlord negotiation strategies. So this is the component where A, what are they going to be doing? And B, what should you do? And how should you approach it? So what's working? When to start? 24 months out from your lease expiry. 24 months at least. Reason being, again, on average, it takes 18 to 24 months to relocate a dental practice properly. So A, it gives leverage, and B, it gives time. So Josh, I'm in New York, I'm speaking with tomorrow evening. He's debating relocating. Now he's about 2.5 years out from expiry, so this is great timing. Great. Now we don't have to rush anything. You can evaluate your options. And depending on where you are in the country, there are certain pockets that you may need to start this 2.5 to 3 years out based on the vacancies in the area. But when to start? General rule of thumb, 24 months out. I'll get to the second component of that in just a minute. But leverage your leverage. No, if you pay your rent on time, you've been a long-standing tenant, and you've obviously built out with leasehold improvements an extensive and expensive amount to upgrade the space, that's your leverage. Other types of businesses are not paying their rent on time. They're not staying there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And if you've bought the practice, it's likely been there even further than that. Renew versus relocate, using it to your advantage, particularly with time. If you have time to consider both, you can utilize that in the negotiations of both the new space and the current space. Working with a doctor right now that is seriously considering relocating if he doesn't get a better deal. And he has a better deal on the table right now in the new space, and we're using it for the current space. He likes his property. He's not anything against it, but in terms of rental rates, he's overpaid and utilizing it for that. Because ideally speaking, you won't have to relocate. And know your key KPIs, so your key performance indicators. What would it actually cost to relocate? Because keep in mind, you're factoring, if it's not a pre-built dental practice, you'd have to build it out as well. So you have to factor that into the overall financial value of leaving. Is it going to be worth it, A, saving in rents, and B, am I going to make that up in terms of return on investment based on the amount of time I'm looking to practice for? Many cases I've heard a doctor who wants to buy a property and build out a practice and also looking to retire in 5 years. Well, again, really depends on the opportunity, but in most cases for that, you don't retain your return on investment. There's just not enough time to amortize that value across in most cases. Rent relief or deferral. Have you taken any? If you haven't, great. If you have, how much? This can work for a benefit depending on how it's positioned. It's really been an unprecedented opportunity, particularly with the vacancies around in each area. This is where it's been an unbelievable opportunity, whether it's to expand, relocate, renew, where everyone's been in it. You felt it as a dental practice and a business, whether you're a single practice, multi-location, or one of the larger group practices, whether it's 20, 30, 40 locations plus. There's going to be different practices and different strategies based on that, different leverage points. We're working with 40 practice location practice right now. They're actually 42, but it's particularly one where, depending on where the practice is located, there's a very different strategy between small town to city to office building to strip plaza. Very different type depending on where they are. Now, what do I do? Take action. There was a doctor who was month to month, who at least it expires. So within 30 days notice, they or the landlord could terminate the lease, which I never recommend for any dental tenants. That, well, if I don't have the 2 years out, should I just express my option or try and just extend my lease and deal with it later when I have the leverage? You still have leverage. There's very different type of strategy. It's approached very differently than when you have time. But there's no better time than the present to fix the issues that are in there or to plan ahead. Now, the tenant lease cycle. So I touched on this briefly previously in terms of timing. So again, 24 months out from expiry is when we recommend. That's for two reasons. The two critical dates in your lease are your lease expiry and B, your option to renew deadline. Typically, it's anywhere between 3 months out from expiry, 6 months, 9 months, up to 12 months, sometimes more, or some sort of combination where you can express it between 9 and 12 months. If you're looking to make changes, you need to ensure you're well before that because you want to use that as the ace in your back pocket, so to speak. So if they're being completely unreasonable, then you have the ability and security to stay in the space. So I have a few questions here that I'll touch on. Some of them were kind of relevant from the previous slide as well. So from an individual, what is the average number of years to recoup investment of owning versus renting? So really depends on the opportunity. The general rule of thumb, and keep in mind, we're across the country here currently, right now, coast to coast. So keep in mind that it's very general, but 10 years is typically the general rule of thumb of an ROI or return on investment to recoup something for purchasing a property that you're building out of practice as well. Now, keep in mind, really depends on the type of property. If you've got a steal of a deal, so to speak, obviously that can vary as well. Or if it's pre-built, if it's single tenant to multi-tenant, we'll have a variance in that. We call it just in and around the 10-year mark is usually the amortization period. But again, very, very general. We can get into a little bit more detail of that, separately if you'd like. So the next question is, can you briefly define and delineate Class A versus Class B office space, location, quality of building, etc.? At a high level, Class A are going to be the newer buildings that have kind of the grocery type of tenants, the chain type of tenants, where whether it's the Starbucks, you're talking the Costco's, Walmart's, things of that nature, where they're just the top of the top. You're paying premium rents, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because you typically also receive the high walk-by traffic or drive-in traffic as well. Class B, they can vary. When you get into Class B and C, really will depend on where the age of the property, the type of building. So if it's whether it's some are commercial, the residential mixed use, things of that nature as well. Think of it as it goes through a scale to simplify it. The Class A's are the premium. As you go through the classes down, it just gets down to the type of quality with it as well. Not to say again, A is better than any other. All depends on your plan because I've seen doctors where they're in a Class B or C, and the way they have it set up, the practice marketed, they've done phenomenal as well. So it all depends on what you're looking for and what the type of practice you're looking to build. So another doctor is asking, I'm looking to acquire a practice where lease is transferable, but there is only 3 years left. Should we negotiate as we require now? A likelihood is, depending on the amount that you're looking to purchase the practice for, you likely need to extend it anyways to even get a loan. But B, absolutely. If you're about to invest a significant amount of money into a practice where there's only 3 years of predictability, what happens if that landlord is just not willing to renew the lease, for example's sake? Now you've just invested, 100,000, 200, 3, 4, in some cases it's $2 million into a practice where now you just have to relocate. How does that impact with patient attrition, a new property, new building? So 100%, if there's low term on the rent, or sorry, on the lease, then absolutely you should be looking to, it's called an assign, extend, and amend as well. And anytime during the acquisition process, obviously there's the purchase and sale where you're looking at the goodwill, the equipment, what's it worth, what's the profits, what's it's grossing, what's the quality, the area, the location. You should also be having the lease reviewed, because not only are you inheriting, the lease is transferred from seller to buyer, you're not only inheriting the good of that practice, all the great, yeah, the production, the profits, you're also inheriting the liabilities. What happens if there's termination rights? What happens if the options to renew aren't transferable? So you only have 3 years left. The selling doctor is not going to care for the most part. Some are very generous, but for the most part, many will not care. So absolutely should be negotiating. Now, a big part is, in terms of this component, is knowing what the financials are. Everyone's thought is, how do I lower my monthly amount? So doing the proper due diligence first beforehand. What is the fair market in the area based on that specific type of property and area? What should I be paying? Now, the strategies of success. So we are just about a little after 6:50 here. So we've just got a couple of more slides here before going into the end of Q&A. I won't keep us too long. I know it's been a long day and long afternoon, depending on where we are in the country, but there's an 8-step process that we follow. So first and foremost, we gather all documents, original lease, extensions, amendments, estoppels. We identify our client's practice and career goals they're looking to do. Stay here, open other locations, expand, purchase the property, whatever the case. We're reviewing the lease in detail, so highlighting all the risks, exposures, liabilities, preparing market research, so determining if they're overpaying in rent, or obviously if it's fair or underpaying. Developing an outcome and strategy based on those goals and visions for the practice. Developing a strategy for that. Now, the first 5 steps are the 5 steps that most make the mistake of missing, where they receive a renewal notice, for example, and instantly start negotiating rents, but forget about everything else. Have a proper strategy in place first. So step 6, now we get to contact the landlord. Typically, initially, it's the financial negotiations. So free rent, rental rates, escalations, fixed stream period, things of that nature. Once those are agreed upon, then it's typically moved towards the legal terms and provisions. So on average, the economics typically take a little over 15 hours on average based on our metrics last year. And to negotiate the legal terms and provisions was it was about 36 hours and change. Now, before executing, there's a full final review. It's as if it's the very first time we've ever seen the document. You'd be surprised how many times a landlord has snuck back in provisions that we agreed on taking out. Always review the final documentation as if it's the first time you've ever reviewed it prior to signing. Now, one of our services is a critical dates and risk analysis for those who were curious. Now, we spend essentially what it entails. It's a lease review where we spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease for traps. Essentially, what occurs is an economic and legal analysis where our leasing team will do a dive into the market in terms of rental rates, comparables, as well as the proprietary data that we have, while our legal team goes through the legal terms and provisions, so highlighting all the risks, exposures, liabilities. We then schedule a call with you, typically about an hour long, and we go through everything in detail. So your vision, your plan, some of the items in the lease, and how they could impact you, and then essentially a treatment plan at the end. Now, for everyone here this evening, I'd like to thank Henry Schein for having us as well. Typically, the lease review is a $1,995 um, dollar value, so essentially $2,000. They've actually covered the cost for everyone on the webinar this evening to receive it complimentary. So there is no fee for it. What I'll need on my end is the original lease, plus any extensions, amendments, estoppel certificates, any supporting documents, whether you prefer to scan an email or fax over. Let us know a few dates and times. Myself or one of my associates will be scheduling with you, particularly to who is overseeing that area and very familiar with that market. Then we'll schedule a call with you and go through everything in detail. So whether you're starting up a practice and you're curious or acquire practice, we'll walk you through the steps of what to expect, what occurs, what to look out for. If you have a lease, then we'll be reviewing that obviously and keen to based on your plans and what you're looking to do, or if you have some questions in general. If you're looking to expand, very similar, or if you're looking to transition, very similar as well. If you are an owner occupant in the sense of you own the space that you practice out of, we will be catering whether you have a lease or not. If you have a lease, we'll review it for you and tell you based on your plans and real estate plans how to adjust it if need be. And if you don't have one, we'll walk you through what needs to be in place. It occurs based on what you're looking to do with the investment. Now, I appreciate everyone's time this evening. I know it's been a long day. I will be answering questions now. There was one here. Forgive me if I don't have it fully answered, as it looks like it popped out of my question answering, but I know it was earlier on the presentation. I was talking about our compensation and so forth. It's really depends on the scope of the project with it, and so it's really dependent on it. We are directly compensated from our clients, but before any of that, I'd highly recommend that the lease review. That's what it also assists with. Is if you are looking for any assistance or curious about our assistance, it really assists with the scope of the work to find out what you're looking to do, what are your plans, and obviously whether it's without a lease, if it's a new start or acquisition, or if you do have one, we'll be able to review the quality of it, see the risks, exposures, liabilities. If it's great, obviously very different from it as well. Another question here: does Cirrus also help landlords with rentals and leases? So this particular one, we are known as a tenant representation firm. The only time that we've assisted, I guess, a landlord per se is if it's a dental client that we've assisted with the lease to help facilitate that process. That is the only time that we assist landlords. No time do we assist any other. So a question here: a doctor is month to month and debating, I guess, relocating or renewing their lease. What is essentially what is the benefit or con of that? And so, in terms of a very particular type of situation, as time is not your friend, being month to month, because if the landlord finds out that you're looking elsewhere, then you're in a situation where they have the ability to either say, and it's occurred in the past where rents have increased 40% or get out type of a situation. So, highly never recommend in terms of a month to month tenancy. If you are in one, I highly recommend letting us know of the urgency of the situation to connect and discuss. Particularly if there's any other type of situation like that, please note that as well. But if you are month to month, sooner than later and very strategically, it should be approached. So in some cases, we'll simultaneously talk about a renewal while also looking elsewhere, whether it's a plan B or C or to whatever extent. But it helps at least give you a proper evaluation of whether you want to stay or go. Decide.
Ryan, we've got another question here. One doctor is wondering when is actually the best time to begin the negotiation of your lease.
Great question. So, as I mentioned in the webinar, 24 months out, in most cases, depending on where you are, there's certain pockets of the country where I actually recommend later, like 3 years out, because of the vacancy. Now, here we've seen a bit of a shift, but it will very quickly turn around. But 24 months out will be the general rule.
Great. And then the only other question I'm seeing is considering COVID right now, is now a good time to expand my practice?
Absolutely. We are working on more expansions over the last probably 4 months than we typically see. There's vacancies in spaces where they typically haven't been vacant, where practices have been bursting at the seams for a long time, but the neighboring tenant has just been very steady and hasn't moved or relocated or anything of that nature. And finally, the time has come where they have the opportunity to. And so many are taking advantage of it. Yes. Now, what I would encourage is evaluating the situation first. Is it going to be worth it, and so forth. That's a big part of it.
Great. That is all of the questions I see. Did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
That's perfect. If any other questions come up, whether they're big or small, or one question here and there, feel free to reach out. My contact information is below. If you would like to take advantage of the complimentary lease consultation, again, Henry Schein has very kindly covered the cost for that. Just let us know. Happy to facilitate the process. If you're whether you're have a situation that you need to know more about, if you're just curious, or if obviously need some assistance as well. But it's been a pleasure. I hope everyone enjoys their evening. Be well, stay healthy, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan, for your time this evening. Excellent content as always. If anyone does have additional questions about renegotiation of your dental lease, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com, or feel free to reach out to Sears Consulting at the contact info on the screen, and someone will get back to you shortly. Additionally, if you are interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming webinars. As a thank you for attending tonight, everyone will receive the recording of tonight's webinar via email later this week. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars.